In the depths of night, between the pages of history long forgotten, a name whispers, a name that carries the darkest secrets of the Knights Templar, a name that tells us there weren't just 12 but 13 in that sacred circle. And this 13th person, they were never supposed to exist. You've heard the stories. 9 founding knights, the official 12 who formed the inner circle. But what if I told you there was another? Someone so dangerous to the established narrative that their very existence was erased from every chronicle, every charter, every stone tablet that bore the Templar cross. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of centuries pressing down. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of medieval warriors or lost treasure. This is the story of a shadow that moved behind the shadows, a master who guided the masters, a 13th member whose name was deliberately carved out of history with the precision of a blade. Before we venture deeper into this labyrinth of secrets, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a revelation that history tried to bury. The year is 1119. Jerusalem burns under the desert sun, its stones still warm with the blood of conquest. In the ruins of Solomon's temple, 9 knights kneel in a circle, their voices barely above a whisper, as they swear an oath that will echo through the ages. But if you count carefully, if you look at the shadows cast by torchlight, you'll see there are actually 10 figures present. The 10th figure stands apart, hooded, silent. They don't kneel. They don't speak the oath aloud, but their presence seems to bend the very air around them, as if the weight of some terrible knowledge makes even the ancient stones tremble. This is Brother Matthias de Montfort. At least, that's the name he used in Jerusalem. But names, as you'll discover, were as changeable as shadows for this man who would become the most powerful figure the Templars never officially acknowledged. Picture the scene more clearly now. The 9 founding knights, Hugh de Payens, Geoffrey, Desti Omer, Payen de Montdier, and their brothers-in-arms believe they are the beginning of something holy, a military order dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. But standing in the darkness beyond their circle, Matthias knows better. He knows this moment isn't a beginning at all. It's a continuation, a carefully orchestrated step in a plan that stretches back centuries, perhaps even millennia. Because Matthias carries with him something the other knights cannot even imagine. Documents. Ancient documents that speak of bloodlines that predate Christ himself, of knowledge that would make the church's foundations crumble like sand. You see, what history doesn't tell you is that the Templars weren't founded by 9 French knights seeking adventure and salvation. They were recruited, chosen, guided into position by someone who already understood the true nature of what lay buried beneath Jerusalem. Someone who knew that the Temple of Solomon held more than just memories of ancient worship that Matthias had spent years preparing for this moment. Born into a minor noble family in the shadow of the Pyrenees, he had shown an unusual aptitude for languages and numbers from childhood. By the age of 15, he could read Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic with equal fluency. By 20, he had memorized entire sections of texts that most scholars would never be permitted to see. But it wasn't his intellectual gifts that set him apart. It was what he discovered in a crumbling monastery outside Barcelona when he was 23 years old. The monastery of Saint-Père-de-Rhodes was ancient, even by the standards of the 11th century. Its foundations rested on stones that some whispered were older than Christianity itself, and in its deepest vault, behind walls that hadn't been opened in living memory, young Matthias found something that changed the course of his life forever. A single parchment, written in a script that seemed to shift between Latin and something far older. The ink was faded, the edges crumbled, but the message was clear enough to those who knew how to read between the lines. It spoke of a great deception, a truth hidden so well that even those who guarded it had forgotten what they protected. The parchment told of a bloodline, not the bloodline of Christ, as some Templar legends would later claim, but something older. A genetic thread that wove through the ruling families of Europe, carrying with it knowledge that predated the written word, knowledge of technologies, of powers, of connections between the earthly and the divine that would terrify the church, if they ever came to light. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The parchment wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a map, a guide to finding others who carried this ancient blood, and more importantly, a key to unlocking the secrets that had been scattered across the known world to keep them safe. Matthias spent the next 5 years following that map. He traveled from the monasteries of Ireland to the libraries of Constantinople, from the caves of Cappadocia to the ruins of Alexandria. And everywhere he went he found traces, fragments of knowledge that, when assembled, painted a picture of the world that was radically different from anything taught by priest or king. He learned that the great monuments of the ancient world weren't built by slave labor and primitive tools, but by technologies that had been deliberately suppressed. He discovered that certain bloodlines carried genetic memories, actual memories that could be awakened under the right circumstances. And most dangerous of all, he found evidence that the church itself was built on a foundation of lies designed to hide these deeper truths. By 1118, Matthias had assembled enough evidence to support a theory that would have seen him burned as a heretic if he had spoken it aloud. But he didn't speak it. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He began to act on it. He identified the 9 men who would become the founding Templars, not through divine inspiration or random chance, but through careful genealogical research. Each of them carried traces of the ancient bloodline. Each of them had the potential to access the memories and knowledge that lay dormant in their genes. They just needed to be awakened. And so Matthias arranged for them to meet, not through obvious manipulation that would have aroused suspicion, but through a series of seemingly coincidental encounters. A word here, a suggestion there, a rumor of treasure waiting to be found in the Holy Land. Like a master puppeteer, he drew the strings until his chosen 9 found themselves in Jerusalem, convinced that the idea to form a military order had been their own. But even as he guided them into position, Matthias knew that 9 wouldn't be enough. The knowledge he had uncovered was too vast, too dangerous to entrust to any single group. He needed redundancy. He needed insurance. He needed a 13th member who could exist outside the official structure, someone who could preserve the truth even if the visible order fell. And so he became that 13th member himself. The ritual in Solomon's temple that night in 1119 wasn't just the founding of the Knights Templar. It was the activation of something far older. As the 9 Knights spoke their oaths. Matthias spoke his own in silence. Not an oath of service to God or church, but a vow to preserve the ancient knowledge no matter the cost. In the days that followed, as the Templars established their headquarters in the ruins above the temple, Matthias began his real work. While the others concerned themselves with protecting pilgrims and establishing their reputation, he descended into the chambers beneath Jerusalem. Chambers that he already knew existed because the ancient parchment had told him where to look. What he found there would have staggered even the most educated scholars of the age. Libraries carved into living rock, their shelves filled with scrolls and codices that predated any known civilization. Star charts showing constellations that wouldn't be discovered for another 800 years. Mathematical formulas that wouldn't be invented until the Renaissance. And most shocking of all, detailed accounts of technologies that wouldn't exist until the industrial age. But the greatest treasure Matthias uncovered wasn't written on parchment or carved in stone. It was genetic, preserved in sealed chambers that had maintained perfect conditions for millennia. Were samples of blood. Actual blood from the bearers of the ancient bloodline. Blood that still carried the genetic keys to unlocking the dormant memories that lay hidden in the descendants. Now you might think this sounds like fantasy, like the fevered imaginings of conspiracy theorists, desperate to find meaning in chaos. But consider this. How else do you explain the Templars' meteoric rise to power? How did 9 unknown knights become the most influential military and financial force in medieval Europe in just a few short decades? The official history tells us they succeeded through divine favor and military prowess, but the truth is far more complex. Under Matthias's guidance, the Templars began to awaken the genetic memories carried in their bloodline. Knowledge that had been dormant for thousands of years suddenly became accessible. Military strategies that shouldn't have been invented for centuries. Financial instruments that wouldn't be discovered until the Renaissance. Engineering techniques that allowed them to build fortifications that shouldn't have been possible with medieval technology. But perhaps most importantly, they gained the ability to recognize others who carried the bloodline. This wasn't guesswork or genealogical research. It was genetic recognition that operated on a level deeper than conscious thought. The Templars could literally sense potential recruits, drawing them into the order with an efficiency that seemed miraculous to outside observers. And all of this was coordinated by a man who officially didn't exist. Matthias de Montfort never appeared on any Templar roster. His name wasn't inscribed on any charter or carved into any memorial stone. To the outside world, to historians both medieval and modern, he simply wasn't there. But his influence can be felt in every major decision the Templars made for the next 2 centuries, when the order established its first commandery outside Jerusalem. It was Matthias who chose the location based on his knowledge of ancient ley lines and energy points. When they developed their famous banking system, allowing depositors in one country to withdraw funds in another, using only an encrypted note, it was Matthias who provided the cryptographic knowledge that made such a system possible. When they built their great fortresses from Scotland to Cyprus, it was Matthias who ensured that each one was positioned at a point of maximum strategic and mystical significance. But maintaining such influence while remaining officially invisible required more than just careful planning. It required the creation of an entirely parallel structure within the Templars, a secret organization within the secret organization. This inner circle, never acknowledged in any official document, consisted of Templars who had been fully awakened to their genetic heritage. They communicated through codes so sophisticated that they wouldn't be cracked until the age of computers. They met in chambers that existed in the spaces between official architecture, hidden rooms that could only be accessed by those who knew the ancient geometric secrets. And at the center of it all stood the man who was never there. By 1140-21, years after the founding ceremony, Matthias had become something unprecedented in medieval Europe. He was simultaneously the most powerful and most invisible man alive. Kings sought his advice without knowing his name. Popes issued bulls that unwittingly followed his strategic guidance. The greatest military campaigns of the Crusades unfolded according to plans he had drawn up in chambers that officially didn't exist. But with great power came great danger. The very success of the Templars was beginning to attract unwanted attention. Other bloodlines, ones that carried different genetic memories, different ancient knowledge, began to take notice. The Church hierarchy, while benefiting from Templar wealth and military might, started to ask uncomfortable questions about the source of their seemingly supernatural abilities. Most dangerous of all, Matthias began to realize that he wasn't alone. Scattered across Europe and the Middle East, other bearers of the ancient bloodline were awakening on their own. Some were allies drawn to the Templar caused by genetic recognition, but others were competitors, even enemies, who saw the Templars' growing power as a threat to their own ancient agendas. The stage was being set for a conflict that would make the Crusades look like a minor border dispute, a war not between Christians and Muslims or even between church and state, but between different branches of humanity itself, a war between those who carried the memories of the ancient world and those who preferred that those memories remain buried forever. And somewhere in the shadows, watching it all unfold, the 13th member prepared for the battles to come, the battles that would ultimately determine not just the fate of the Knights Templar, but the future direction of human civilization itself. As you drift deeper into sleep, remember this: the man who shaped the medieval world was the man who was never there. The most important decisions in European history were made by someone whose name appears in no official record. And the truth about who we are and where we came from was preserved not by those who ruled in the light, but by those who worked in the darkness between shadows. The stones remember everything. Deep beneath the Temple Mount, where no pilgrim's foot has tread for 1,000 years, the ancient blocks still hold the whispers of those who carved them. And in 1142, as Matthias de Montfort descended into chambers that shouldn't have existed, those stones began to speak in languages older than Latin, older than Hebrew, older than human memory itself. You can feel the weight of Jerusalem above as you follow him down passages carved with mathematical precision. The air grows thicker with each step, heavy with the scent of cedar oil and something else, something metallic and electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. This isn't just archaeology you're witnessing. This is the moment when the hidden history of humanity cracked open like an egg. 23 years had passed since the founding ceremony. The 9 visible Templars had established themselves as a force to be reckoned with, their influence spreading across the Christian world like ripples in a still pond. But all of their public achievements, the commanderies built, the pilgrims protected, the political alliances forged, were merely the surface of a much deeper game. Matthias had used those 23 years well, while his official brothers consolidated their earthly power. He had been preparing for something far more ambitious. Using the genetic memories awakened in the founding circle, he had managed to locate and map the complete network of chambers that existed beneath Jerusalem. Not just beneath the Temple Mount, but extending outward in a pattern that defied explanation. Picture a vast spider's web made of tunnels and chambers stretching beneath the entire holy city. Each node in the web contained knowledge, mathematical formulas that wouldn't be discovered for centuries, star charts showing celestial movements with accuracy that wouldn't be matched until the age of computers, medical text describing surgical techniques that wouldn't be attempted until the Renaissance, but most importantly, genealogical records that traced the ancient bloodline through thousands of years of human history. What Matthias had discovered was nothing less than the greatest library ever assembled, a collection of knowledge so vast and so dangerous that it had been deliberately hidden from human civilization for millennia. And at its center, in the deepest chamber directly beneath the foundation stone of Solomon's temple itself, lay something that would change everything: the Codex Sanguinis, the Book of Blood. You need to understand what made this document so extraordinary. It wasn't written on parchment or papyrus, wasn't carved into stone or pressed into clay. The Codex Sanguinis was inscribed on sheets of a material that seemed to pulse with its own inner light, a substance that looked like metal but felt warm and alive to the touch. Each page contained not just text and diagrams, but something else: samples, actual genetic material from the bearers of the ancient bloodline, preserved in microscopic chambers within the metal itself. This was genetic memory made literal. By touching the pages and performing certain rituals described within the text itself, readers could literally experience the memories of their ancestors. Not just learned knowledge passed down through stories, but actual sensory experiences from thousands of years in the past. The taste of food from vanished civilizations, the sight of cities that predated any known history, the sound of languages that had been forgotten before Babylon fell. But the Codex contained more than just memories. It held warnings. As Matthias read deeper into the text, using translation techniques that seemed to download themselves directly into his consciousness, he began to understand why this knowledge had been hidden. The ancient bloodline wasn't human, at least not entirely human. It was hybrid, the product of genetic engineering so sophisticated that it wouldn't be understood until the 21st century. The ancestors, the text revealed, had come from elsewhere, not necessarily another planet. The Codex was frustratingly vague about geographical details, but somewhere else. They had arrived at a time when early humans were barely more than intelligent animals, and they had seen potential, the capacity for growth, for consciousness, for something greater. So they had intervened. Carefully, selectively, they had introduced their own genetic material into certain human bloodlines, not to create slaves or worshippers, but to create something new, a hybrid species that combined human adaptability with their own advanced cognitive abilities. and the result was a small population of individuals who carried what the Codex called the active sequence, genetic patterns that could be triggered under the right circumstances to unlock capabilities that seemed miraculous to ordinary humans. These activated individuals became the leaders, the innovators, the builders of the first great civilizations. They were the pharaohs of Egypt, the god-kings of Sumeria, the mysterious builders of megalithic monuments that still confound archaeologists today. They possessed technologies that allowed them to move massive stones, to calculate astronomical events with incredible precision, to heal diseases and extend lifespans far beyond normal human parameters. But something had gone wrong. The Codex spoke of a great catastrophe, not a natural disaster, but a war. A conflict between two factions of the hybrid bloodline that had torn apart the ancient world. One faction believed that ordinary humans should be gradually uplifted, brought to the same level of consciousness and capability as their hybrid rulers. The other faction saw regular humans as nothing more than livestock, to be managed and controlled for the benefit of their genetic superiors. The war had lasted for centuries, ravaging the earth and destroying most traces of the advanced civilizations that had existed before recorded history began. In the end, neither side had won. The uplifters had been too few in number to survive the conflict, while the controllers had found their power structures crumbling as the very humans they had tried to dominate turned against them. The survivors had made a desperate decision. They would go into hiding. The most dangerous knowledge would be scattered and concealed, preserved but protected from those who might misuse it. The hybrid bloodline would be dispersed throughout human populations, its special capabilities dormant unless deliberately awakened. And most importantly, safeguards would be put in place to prevent either faction from ever again gaining enough power to threaten the balance of the world. As Matthias absorbed this information, he began to realize the true scope of what he had stumbled into. The Knights Templar weren't just another medieval military order. They were the latest incarnation of an ancient network dedicated to preserving the hidden knowledge while preventing its misuse. The genetic recognition that had allowed him to identify the founding nine wasn't supernatural. It was an evolved survival mechanism, a way for scattered members of the bloodline to find each other in times of crisis. But if the Templars were the modern guardians of the ancient knowledge, then who were their enemies? The answer came to him as he read deeper into the Codex. The opposing faction hadn't disappeared after the ancient war, they had simply adapted. Instead of trying to rule openly as god-kings, they had learned to work through proxies. They infiltrated existing power structures, manipulating from within. They established secret societies and religious orders, dedicated to maintaining the status quo and suppressing any knowledge that might threaten their control. And they had been watching the Templars from the very beginning. The church hierarchy that had initially supported the Templars' formation hadn't done so out of religious conviction. They had been guided subtly but systematically by representatives of the controller faction who saw the new military order as a potential threat that needed to be monitored and contained. The same was true of many European monarchs who had granted the Templars lands and privileges. They weren't acting out of generosity, but following suggestions planted by advisors whose true loyalties lay elsewhere. This revelation sent chills down Matthias's spine. The Templars' rapid rise to power hadn't been the result of divine favor or superior ability. It had been allowed, even encouraged, by enemies who wanted to draw them into the open where they could be studied, understood, and ultimately destroyed. But the controller faction had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that the Templars would follow the same pattern as previous incarnations of the Guardian network, that they would eventually become corrupted by power and lose sight of their original mission. What they hadn't counted on was the 13th member, a figure who existed outside their surveillance network, who had access to the complete codex rather than just fragments, and who understood the full scope of the ancient conflict. Matthias realized that he was in a unique position. For the first time in millennia, the Guardian faction had a strategic advantage. The controllers believed they were manipulating a naive group of medieval knights, but in reality they were dealing with someone who possessed knowledge that predated their own power structures by thousands of years. The game was about to change, but first, Matthias needed allies. The 9 official Templars, while awakened to their genetic heritage, still didn't understand the full scope of what they were involved in. They saw themselves as holy warriors blessed with unusual insight and ability, not as the latest generation in an ancient genetic experiment. To survive what was coming, they would need to understand the truth. This was when Matthias made one of the most dangerous decisions in human history. He decided to create the Council of 13. Working in absolute secrecy, he began to identify other members of the Templar Order who showed signs of carrying the active genetic sequence. Not all Templars were bloodline carriers. Many were simply exceptional individuals who had been recruited for their skills and loyalty. But scattered throughout the ranks were perhaps 24 individuals who carried the genetic markers that indicated hybrid ancestry. From these, Matthias carefully selected 12 to join him in the council. Each was approached individually, brought down into the chambers beneath Jerusalem, and exposed to the Codex Sanguinis. The experience was transformative. As they touched the metal pages and felt the ancient memories flooding into their consciousness, each member of the council underwent a fundamental change in understanding. They were no longer medieval knights serving a Christian order. They were guardians of humanity's hidden heritage, protectors of knowledge that could either elevate the human race or destroy it entirely. And they were the front line in a war that had been raging since before recorded history began. The council's first meeting took place in the deepest chamber beneath the temple, with the Codex Sanguinis lying open at the center of a circle formed by 13 chairs carved from the living rock. By torchlight and voices that seemed to echo with the weight of millennia, they swore a new oath. Not the public vows of the Knights Templar, but a private commitment that bound them to something far older and more sacred than any earthly order. They would preserve the ancient knowledge. They would protect humanity from those who would exploit the genetic legacy for their own benefit. And they would prepare for the inevitable moment when the controller faction realized that their carefully laid plans had been discovered and countered. That moment came sooner than any of them expected. In the summer of 1143, as the council was still learning to access the full range of abilities encoded in their DNA, disturbing reports began to reach Jerusalem. Across Europe, Templar commanderies were receiving visits from mysterious figures claiming to represent various church authorities. These visitors asked detailed questions about Templar practices, requested access to financial records, and seemed particularly interested in any unusual discoveries the Knights might have made in the Holy Land. At first, the visit seemed routine, just the normal oversight that any religious order might expect. But Matthias's enhanced perceptions picked up patterns that ordinary humans would have missed. The visitors all asked the same specific questions, phrased in nearly identical language. They all showed interest in the same types of information. And most tellingly, they all carried traces of genetic markers that indicated hybrid ancestry from the controller faction. The enemy had found them. Revelation that both sides of the ancient conflict had successfully infiltrated medieval European society sent shockwaves through the Council of 13. For thousands of years, the two factions had maintained an uneasy balance, with neither side having enough active members to gain a decisive advantage. But now, for the first time since the ancient war, both groups were beginning to awaken in significant numbers. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine the future of human evolution itself. And at the center of it all stood 13 figures whose very existence had been erased from history, preparing for a battle that the rest of the world wouldn't even know was being fought. In the flickering torchlight of that underground chamber, surrounded by knowledge that predated civilization itself, the Council of 13 began to plan their strategy. They had perhaps 5 years before the controller faction would move against them openly. 5 years to prepare defenses, to awaken more members of their own bloodline, and to position themselves for a conflict that would make the Crusades look like a minor disagreement between neighbors. The ancient war was about to resume, and this time the future of humanity itself hung in the balance. The letter arrived on a morning when the desert wind carried the scent of distant storms. Brother Geoffrey de Charny, commander of the Templar fortress at Safed, held the parchment with hands that had killed in the name of Christ and counted gold in the name of his order. But as his eyes traced the familiar script, Latin words arranged in patterns that seemed innocent to any casual observer, his blood ran cold. The message was from Matthias, the 13th member, the man who existed in the spaces between official records. And after 24 years of subtle guidance and hidden communication, his words carried a weight that made the fortress walls seem fragile as parchment. The Watchers have become hunters. The time of subtlety has ended. Gather the bloodline. Prepare the keys. The ancient covenant is about to be tested. You can feel the tension in that chamber as Geoffrey decoded the full message using ciphers that had been old when Rome was young. Each additional layer of meaning revealed a more terrifying truth. The controller faction wasn't just monitoring the Templars anymore, they were moving to eliminate them. And they had resources that the Council of 13 was only beginning to understand. Across Europe, the pattern was repeating. In commanderies from Scotland to Cyprus, Templar commanders were receiving similar messages through channels so secure that their very existence was known only to members of the inner circle. Each message contained the same core intelligence. After centuries of patient observation, the descendants of the ancient controllers had decided that the Guardian faction had become too dangerous to tolerate. The evidence was overwhelming. In Paris, 3 Templar knights had died in what appeared to be random accidents. A horse that suddenly went mad, a stone that fell from scaffolding at precisely the wrong moment, a fever that struck down a man who had never been sick a day in his life. But to those who knew what to look for, the pattern was clear. Each dead knight had been identified by the council as carrying the active genetic sequence. Each had recently begun to show signs of awakening to their true heritage. In London, a Templar preceptory had been searched by officials claiming to investigate reports of heretical practices. Nothing incriminating had been found, but the searchers had shown particular interest in genealogical records and had made detailed inquiries about any unusual abilities displayed by members of the order. Most disturbing of all, the lead investigator had been a man whose genetic markers proclaimed him as clearly as a banner to those with enhanced senses. But it was the intelligence from Rome that truly revealed the scope of what they faced. Brother Marcus of Viterbo had spent 5 years carefully cultivating contacts within the Vatican hierarchy. Officially, he was simply a Templar liaison, facilitating communication between the order and the papal court. Unofficially, he was one of the most skilled intelligence operatives in the medieval world, using abilities awakened by his contact with the Codex Sanguines to read intentions and emotions with supernatural accuracy. His latest report made for chilling reading. The controller faction had not just infiltrated the church. They had been guiding its development for centuries. Key theological decisions that had shaped Christian doctrine had been influenced by advisors carrying the ancient bloodline. The Inquisition, with its emphasis on rooting out heretical knowledge and maintaining orthodox thought, wasn't just a religious institution. It was a weapon designed specifically to suppress any resurgence of Guardian faction activity. And now, that weapon was being turned directly against the Templars. Pope Innocent IV, the report revealed, had been approached by a group of concerned clerics who claimed to have evidence of dangerous practices within the temple. These clerics, led by a cardinal whose genetic signature screamed controller faction ancestry, had provided detailed documentation of Templar activities that no outside observer should have been able to access. Financial records showing the order's vast wealth. Military reports detailing their unusual tactical successes. And most damaging of all, testimonies from former Templars describing rituals and practices that seemed to border on the supernatural. The documentation was too detailed to be fabricated, too accurate to be based on guesswork. Someone within the Templar Order was providing information to the enemy. The Council of 13 had been infiltrated. This revelation sent shockwaves through the hidden network that Matthias had spent decades building. For the first time since the ancient war, the Guardian faction faced the possibility of complete exposure. If the controllers could prove that the Templars possessed knowledge and abilities that violated church doctrine, they could justify not just disbanding the order, but executing every member as heretics. But more than their lives was at stake. If the Council of 13 was destroyed, the knowledge preserved in the chambers beneath Jerusalem would be lost forever. The Codex Sanguinis, with its genetic samples and ancient memories, would fall into the hands of those who would use it to create a new generation of god-kings ruling over enslaved humanity. The response had to be swift, decisive, and absolutely secret. In the deepest chamber beneath the Temple Mount, lit by torches that burned with flames that never seemed to consume their fuel, the Council of 13 convened an emergency session. Each member had traveled to Jerusalem through different Routes using cover identities that had been prepared years in advance. To the outside world, they were simply Templars on routine business. A financial audit here, a military consultation there, a pilgrimage to the Holy Land as penance for some minor sin. But in that hidden chamber, surrounded by knowledge that predated civilization itself, they became something far more dangerous than medieval knights. They became the inheritors of genetic memories that stretched back to the dawn of human consciousness, bearing abilities that would seem miraculous. To ordinary observers, Matthias stood at the center of the circle, the Codex Sanguinus open before him on a pedestal carved from a single block of stone. The metal pages pulsed with their inner light, and as he spoke, his words seemed to carry harmonics that resonated in frequencies just beyond normal human hearing. "Brothers," he began, his voice carrying the weight of millennia, "the ancient. War has resumed. Our enemies have spent 1,000 years infiltrating the power structures of this age, just as they infiltrated those of ages past. They believe they have us trapped, that we will follow the same pattern of previous guardian generations, awakening briefly before being crushed by superior organization and resources." He paused, allowing his enhanced perceptions to read the emotional resonance of each council member. Fear was there, yes, but also determination. And something else, a genetic memory of previous conflicts that ran so deep it felt like racial destiny. "But they have made a crucial error," Matthias continued. "They believe we are bound by the limitations of this medieval age, that we can only work within the constraints of 12th century technology and organization. They do not understand that the Codex has shown us possibilities they cannot imagine." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary planning session in human history. Using knowledge drawn from genetic memories of civilizations that had vanished before the pyramids were built, the council began to develop strategies that wouldn't be understood by military theorists for another 800 years. They would not fight the controller faction directly. That would only confirm the charges of heresy and supernatural practice that were being prepared against them. Instead, they would disappear. Not just the Council of 13, but the entire network of awakened bloodline carriers that had been identified over the previous decades. But this wouldn't be a retreat or an admission of defeat. It would be the most sophisticated deception. Operation in History. Brother Thomas of Barcelona had awakened genetic memories of information warfare techniques used in conflicts that predated written history. Using these ancient insights, he began to craft a narrative that would satisfy the controllers' expectations while concealing the true scope of Guardian faction activities. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Templars would allow themselves to appear corrupted by wealth and power, exactly as their enemies expected. Evidence would be carefully planted to support charges of financial impropriety and religious deviation. Key members would be positioned to confess under interrogation, providing testimony that confirmed the controller's suspicions while revealing nothing of genuine importance. Meanwhile, the real assets would vanish. The awakened bloodline carriers would disappear into new identities, scattering across Europe and beyond to establish hidden enclaves where the ancient knowledge could be preserved. The contents of the chambers beneath Jerusalem would be evacuated and distributed to secure locations that would remain hidden for centuries. And most importantly, new recruitment networks would be established to identify and awaken bloodline carriers and future generations. The controller faction would get their victory, the public destruction of the Knights Templar as a military and financial power. But that victory would be Pyrrhic. They would have eliminated a visible threat while the real Guardian network went deeper underground than ever before. Brother Samuel of Normandy had awakened memories of organizational structures used by resistance movements in ancient times. Working with these insights, he began to design a system of cells and compartments that would allow the Guardian faction to operate for centuries without central coordination. Each cell would have specific responsibilities, some focused on preserving written knowledge, others on maintaining bloodline records, still others on monitoring controller faction activities. Communication between cells would be maintained through methods so subtle that they would be invisible to outside observation. Messages hidden in the architectural details of cathedrals, codes embedded in illuminated manuscripts, signals passed through the positioning of tombstones in cemetery graveyards. The entire network would operate like a vast organism, with each part knowing only what it needed to know while contributing to the greater whole. But perhaps the most ambitious part of the plan involved what Brother Philip of Acre called temporal seeding. Using knowledge drawn from the Codex Sanguinis, certain members of the council would be assigned to establish caches of information and resources that wouldn't be accessed for generations. These caches would be positioned to influence future historical developments in ways that would favor Guardian faction interests. A monastery here, built according to ancient geometric principles that would attract awakened bloodline carriers centuries later. A noble family there, carefully bred, to carry genetic markers that would produce exceptional individuals at crucial historical moments. Investment opportunities that would seem like random speculation to contemporary observers, but would position future Guardian generations to influence the development of banking, trade, and eventually technology. The controller faction thought in terms of decades. The Guardian faction, with access to genetic memories spanning millennia, would plan in terms of centuries. As the council session progressed through the night, the full scope of the deception began to take shape. The destruction of the visible Knights Templar wouldn't be a defeat. It would be camouflage for the largest and most sophisticated intelligence operation in human history. An operation designed not just to preserve the ancient knowledge, but to position the Guardian faction to guide human development through the coming ages. But success would require sacrifice. Many of the council members would have to maintain their cover identities, even as the Templars were destroyed around them. Some would face interrogation, torture, even execution rather than reveal the truth. Others would have to watch helplessly as centuries of work appeared to crumble, knowing that the real victory lay in defeats that no one else could see. As dawn approached and the torches burned lower, Matthias posed a question that would define the next phase of the ancient war. Are you prepared to be forgotten by history in order to shape it? The answer came not in words, but in the harmonized resonance of 13 voices, speaking in frequencies that touched genetic memories older than civilization itself. They were ready. The true battle for humanity's future was about to begin, and the world would never know it was being fought. The morning mist clung to the walls of the Temple Mount like guilty secrets as Brother Hugh de Payens, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, made his final inspection of chambers that would soon be empty forever. In his weathered hands he held a document that would seal the fate of the most powerful military order in Christendom, a confession of heretical practices that would justify their destruction to the world. But as his eyes traced the carefully crafted lies, Hugh smiled, for only he and 12 others knew that this confession was perhaps the greatest masterpiece of deception ever conceived. Every damning detail had been designed by the Council of 13 to satisfy their enemies' expectations while concealing truths that would remake the understanding of human history itself. You can feel the weight of centuries shifting as the plan enters its final phase. What the world was about to witness would be recorded as the tragic fall of the Knights Templar, a cautionary tale of pride, corruption, and divine judgment. But in reality, it would be the most successful intelligence operation in human history, designed to hide an entire bloodline from those who would destroy it. The year was 1147, 4 years after the Council's emergency session in the hidden chambers. 4 years of careful preparation, of positioning assets and establishing escape routes, of creating legends and planting evidence. The controller faction believed they were tightening a noose around the Guardian bloodline. In reality, they were being led into a trap of their own expectations. The first phase of the deception had been the most delicate. Matthias and his inner circle had to make the Templars appear corrupted without actually becoming corrupted. They needed to create evidence of heretical practices without engaging in actual heresy. Most challenging of all, they had to convince their own members, even the awakened ones, that the order was genuinely falling from grace. Brother Thomas of Acre had been instrumental in this phase, using abilities awakened through contact with the Codex Sanguinis. He had identified which Templars carried genetic markers for exceptional acting ability and suggestibility. These individuals were gradually exposed to manufactured evidence of corruption within the order, allowed to discover planted documents and witness staged scenes of misconduct. Their genuine shock and dismay provided the perfect cover for what would follow. When investigators arrived to examine Templar practices, they would find witnesses whose horror and disappointment were completely authentic. Men who truly believed they had served an order that had lost its way, who could provide testimony that would be all the more convincing because they genuinely believed it themselves. Meanwhile, the real work proceeded in shadows deeper than any medieval investigator could penetrate. The contents of the chambers beneath Jerusalem were being evacuated through tunnels that connected to networks older than the city itself. Scrolls and codices that contained knowledge from before the flood were carefully packed in containers, designed to preserve them for centuries. The Codex Sanguinis itself was being prepared for a journey that would take it far from the reach of those who would misuse its secrets. But the most critical element of the operation involved the bloodline itself. Over the previous 4 years, every Templar who carried the active genetic sequence had been quietly provided with new identities. Not false names, those could be detected by enhanced senses, but complete biographical reconstructions that would pass the most thorough investigation. Brother Marcus of Viterbo became Marco the Merchant, with trade records stretching back decades and family connections throughout Italy that had been carefully established through a network of awakened bloodline carriers. Brother Samuel of Normandy transformed into Father Samuel, a humble parish priest whose theological writings had been ghost-written by scholars working from the hidden archives. Brother Philip of Acre simply vanished one night, leaving behind only reports of a pilgrimage to the Holy Land from which he had never returned. Each transformation was a work of art that required resources and coordination on a scale that shouldn't have been possible in the 12th century. But the Guardian faction had advantages that their enemies didn't suspect. Using genetic memories that stretched back to civilizations that had perfected the arts of identity manipulation, they could create false histories that were more convincing than many genuine ones. The Controller faction, monitoring these developments through their own network of agents, saw exactly what they expected to see: a military order collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Individual Templars fleeing rather than face investigation. Assets being hidden to prevent confiscation. The classic pattern of an organization that knew its crimes were about to be exposed. What they didn't see was the second network being established in parallel to the first, as the visible Templars prepared for their staged downfall. A shadow organization was taking shape across Europe and beyond. Safe houses were established in remote locations, their architectural details encoded with information that would guide future generations of Guardian bloodline carriers. Monastery libraries were seeded with texts that appeared to be standard religious works, but contained hidden layers of meaning accessible only to those with awakened genetic memories. Most importantly, recruitment protocols were established that would allow the bloodline to identify and awaken new members across the coming centuries. These protocols were embedded in institutions that would outlast any single government or religious order, universities, guilds, even noble families whose bloodlines had been carefully researched and found to carry the ancient genetic markers. The beauty of the system lay in its complete invisibility to outside observation. A professor of mathematics at the University of Paris might spend his entire career teaching conventional arithmetic while secretly passing advanced theoretical knowledge to students who showed signs of awakened ability. A master mason might build perfectly orthodox cathedrals while encoding structural details that would guide future generations to hidden chambers and preserved knowledge. The Controller faction had spent centuries building their influence within existing power structures. The Guardian faction would build something far more subtle, a parallel civilization that existed within and alongside the visible world, indistinguishable from it to casual observation, but operating according to principles that reached back to the dawn of human consciousness. As the final preparations were completed in Jerusalem, reports began to arrive from across the Templar network. The Controller faction was moving into position for what they believed would be the decisive blow against their ancient enemies. Cardinals known to carry their genetic markers were being positioned in key Vatican offices. Inquisitors whose bloodlines proclaimed their ancestry were being assigned to investigate Templar activities. Even some European monarchs were beginning to receive visits from advisors whose suggestions would lead inevitably toward confrontation with the temple. The stage was being set for a conflict that would be recorded in history books as a struggle between church and military order, between spiritual authority and temporal power. The truth that it was the latest battle in a genetic war that had raged since before civilization began would remain hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. In the deepest chamber beneath the Temple Mount, Matthias prepared for his own transformation. As the 13th member, the figure who existed outside all official records, he faced unique challenges in disappearing from a world that had never officially acknowledged his presence. But he also had unique opportunities, working with genetic memories that included techniques of identity dissolution used in ancient intelligence operations. He began to fragment his own personality across multiple cover identities, not simple disguises or false names, but complete psychological reconstructions that would allow different aspects of his consciousness to operate independently while maintaining connection to the central core of his knowledge and purpose. 1. Fragment would become Brother Matthias the Scribe, a humble monastery copyist whose extraordinary linguistic abilities would be explained as divine inspiration. Another would emerge as Master Matthew the Architect, whose cathedral designs would encode mathematical principles drawn from the Codex Sanguinis. A third would appear as Marcus the Physician, whose understanding of human anatomy and disease would seem miraculous to medieval observers. Each identity would carry a portion of his knowledge and abilities, positioned to influence different aspects of human development as the centuries progressed. The controller faction, even if they suspected the truth, would never be able to track or eliminate all the fragments. The Guardian bloodline's greatest asset would survive not as a single individual, but as a distributed consciousness embedded within the fabric of European civilization itself. As the first false dawn began to lighten the sky over Jerusalem, the evacuation reached its final phase. The last of the ancient documents were sealed in containers that would keep them safe for centuries to come. The Codex Sanguinis was wrapped in preservation materials that incorporated techniques remembered from civilizations that had vanished before Egypt was founded. The hidden chambers were being prepared for abandonment, not destruction, for they might be needed again, but careful concealment that would keep them safe until the bloodline was ready to return above ground. The visible Templars were preparing for roles they didn't know they were playing. In a few hours they would begin receiving visitors, church investigators, armed with accusations and evidence that would justify the destruction of their order. Some would flee, confirming suspicions of guilt. Others would stay and face interrogation, providing testimony that would doom their brothers while revealing nothing of genuine importance. All would play their parts in a drama whose true script was known only to 13 figures whose very existence had been erased from every record that might survive the coming purge. The morning sun was rising over the Holy Land, its light catching the golden dome that crowned the ruins of Solomon's Temple. Below, in chambers that would soon be empty and forgotten, the last guardians of humanity's hidden heritage, prepared to vanish into legends that no one would believe. The great deception was about to begin, and when it ended, the world would think it had witnessed the destruction of the Knights Templar. In reality, it would have witnessed their transformation into something far more dangerous to those who would control human destiny, an invisible network that would guide civilization itself through the dark centuries to come. The controller faction was about to get everything they thought they wanted. They would discover far too late that victory and trap were sometimes the same thing. The flames rose high above the walls of Paris on that October morning in 1307, their smoke carrying with it the screams of men who had once commanded armies and counted kings among their debtors. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights, Templar stood in chains before the Cathedral of Notre Dame, his weathered face showing nothing of the satisfaction he felt as he watched centuries of careful planning reach their culmination. To the thousands of witnesses gathered in the square, they were watching the just punishment of heretics who had betrayed their sacred vows. To the controller faction agents positioned throughout the crowd, they were observing the final destruction of their ancient enemies. But to the few who possessed the genetic memories needed to read the deeper patterns, they were witnessing the greatest intelligence triumph in human history. You need to understand what made this moment so extraordinary. Every aspect of what appeared to be spontaneous chaos had been choreographed with precision that wouldn't be understood by military strategists for another 6 centuries. The arrests, the confessions, the public burnings, all of it, designed to give the controller faction exactly what they expected, while concealing a transformation so profound that it would reshape the course of human civilization. The operation had begun at dawn with simultaneous arrests across France. King Philip IV's man had moved with the efficiency that came from months of detailed planning, surrounding Templar commanderies and seizing knights who showed no resistance because they had been ordered not to resist. The controllers watching from the shadows saw confirmation of guilt in that lack of struggle. Innocent men would have fought. The fact that the Templars submitted so readily proved that they knew their crimes had been discovered. But what the watchers couldn't see was the other operation proceeding in parallel. As visible Templars were being led away in chains, other figures, men whose genetic signatures proclaimed their true heritage to those who could read such signs, were already implementing escape routes that had been prepared for this exact moment. Brother Thomas of Acre, now Thomas the Merchant, was aboard a ship bound for Constantinople before the first arrest warrant had been signed. His cargo manifests listed grain and oil, but hidden within false compartments were documents that contained mathematical principles advanced enough to revolutionize astronomy. Brother Samuel of Normandy had been visiting his sick mother in a remote village for 3 days, establishing an alibi that would be unbreakable because the entire village consisted of awakened bloodline carriers who shared genetic memories going back to the fall of Rome. Each escape had been crafted to appear natural, even inevitable. Men fleeing justice, hiding assets, abandoning their posts, rather than face the consequences of their actions. The controller faction's enhanced senses detected no deception because there was no deception to detect, only a deeper truth hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed reality. The confessions that followed the arrests were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. Using techniques drawn from genetic memories of interrogation methods perfected in ancient civilizations, the awakened Templars provided their captors with exactly the kind of evidence that would satisfy their preconceptions while revealing nothing of genuine importance. Yes, they admitted there had been secret rituals, but the rituals they described were crude parodies of actual guardian practices, designed to sound shocking to medieval sensibilities while concealing the true nature of genetic awakening ceremonies. Yes, they acknowledged, there had been mysterious artifacts in their possession, but the artifacts they detailed were clever fakes that had been prepared specifically for this moment, objects that would seem supernatural to 12th century investigators while containing no actual power or knowledge. Most brilliantly of all, they confessed to worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the controller faction because they recognized it as a distorted reference to ancient bloodline practices. What they didn't realize was that this head was nothing more than an elaborate sculpture crafted by awakened artisans to trigger genetic memories in their enemies, while serving no actual function. The controllers thought they were uncovering evidence of forbidden knowledge being preserved by their ancient rivals. In reality, they were being fed carefully constructed mythology designed to distract them from the real preservation network. That was even now spreading across Europe like an invisible web. As the public trials proceeded and the evidence mounted, King Philip IV found himself in possession of what appeared to be the greatest treasure trove in European history. Templar gold filled his coffers, while Templar lands were distributed among nobles whose loyalty had been secured through careful political maneuvering. The financial crisis that had driven Philip to desperate measures seemed to be resolved at a stroke, but the gold was largely base metal, coated with a thin layer of precious metal using techniques that would be sustainable just long enough for the deception to serve its purpose. The lands came with debts and obligations that had been carefully hidden in legal documents, so complex that their true nature wouldn't be discovered until the royal treasury was thoroughly committed. Within 5 years, Philip would find himself deeper in debt than before, having exchanged real Templar assets for carefully constructed illusions. Meanwhile, the real treasure was being distributed through channels that the medieval world couldn't even imagine. Manuscripts containing advanced engineering principles were being hidden in monastery libraries, where they would wait centuries for readers capable of understanding their significance. Genetic samples preserved in the Codex Sanguinis were being divided among multiple locations, ensuring that the awakening process could continue even if some repositories were discovered and destroyed. Most importantly, the human assets, the awakened bloodline carriers who represented thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and ability, were being repositioned throughout European society. The carpenter who helped rebuild the damaged Templar church in London carried genetic memories of architectural techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. The scribe copying manuscripts in a German monastery could read languages that wouldn't be deciphered by scholars for another 8 centuries. The merchant establishing new trade routes between Venice and Constantinople possessed understanding of economic principles that were centuries ahead of their time. Each placement had been planned with the precision of a chess master thinking 20 moves ahead. The Guardian faction wasn't just preserving their knowledge, they were positioning themselves to guide human development through the dark centuries that they knew were coming, because the awakened members of the Council of 13 could see patterns in history that were invisible to ordinary human perception. They knew that Europe was entering a period of upheaval that would test civilization itself. Plagues would devastate populations. Wars would fragment political structures. The church would face challenges that would shake its authority to the foundations. But they also knew that these crises would create opportunities. In times of chaos, people became more willing to accept new ideas, new technologies, new ways of organizing society. The Guardian network that was now going underground would be perfectly positioned to emerge during these transitional periods, offering innovations and insights that would seem miraculous to contemporary observers while actually being the application of knowledge preserved from previous ages The Black Death, when it came, would create labor shortages that would accelerate the development of new technologies that would be introduced by craftsmen and inventors whose genetic memories contained blueprints from civilizations that had solved similar problems millennia earlier. The breakdown of feudal authority would create opportunities for new forms of organization forms that would be pioneered by merchants and administrators, whose understanding of human nature had been refined through thousands of years of accumulated experience. Even the challenges to church authority would be guided by the hidden network. The printing press, when it was invented, would spread ideas that had been carefully seeded into European intellectual culture by scholars whose true nature was known only to themselves. The Renaissance would witness the rediscovery of classical knowledge that had actually been preserved in hidden archives, maintained by the guardian bloodline dot as the last visible Templars were led to their execution. Matthias stood in a crowd of witnesses whose genetic signatures proclaimed them as clearly as banners to his enhanced senses. They believed they were watching the end of the guardian faction's influence on human development. They had no way of knowing that they were actually witnessing its transformation into something far more powerful and far more dangerous to their own agenda. The 13th member had ceased to exist as a single individual. His consciousness, fragmented across multiple identities, using techniques that reached back to the earliest days of genetic manipulation, now existed as a distributed intelligence embedded within European civilization itself. Part of him was already aboard ships bound for distant lands where new colonies of awakened bloodline carriers would establish themselves beyond the reach of the controller faction. Part of him was walking the roads of Europe as a wandering scholar, carrying knowledge that would be selectively revealed to individuals whose genetic markers indicated readiness for awakening dot, and part of him was standing in this very crowd, wearing the face of a simple tradesman, watching his own death being celebrated by enemies who had no idea that they had just witnessed not the end of their greatest threat, but its metamorphosis into something beyond their ability to track or control. The great deception was complete. The controller faction would spend the next several centuries congratulating themselves on their decisive victory over the guardian bloodline, never realizing that they had actually midwifed its transformation into the invisible force that would guide human civilization through the most crucial period in its development, the flames consuming the last visible. Templars cast long shadows across the square, but those shadows fell upon ground where the seeds of the future had already been planted, waiting for the right moment to grow into something the ancient world had never imagined. The medieval age was ending. The hidden age was about to begin. The plague came to Florence in the summer of 1348, carried on trade winds that had blown across continents and through the dreams of men who thought they understood the natural world. But in a small workshop tucked behind the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, a man who called himself Master Leonardo, though that was not the name his parents had given him, worked with steady hands to complete designs that would save thousands of lives. His drawings showed water purification systems that wouldn't be invented for another 4 centuries. His notes detailed quarantine procedures that seemed to demonstrate supernatural understanding of disease transmission. And in the margins of his manuscripts, written in a script that shifted between Latin and symbols older than Rome, were observations that revealed the true nature of what Europe was facing. You see, the Black Death wasn't just a pandemic. It was a test, a crucible designed to separate those bloodlines that carried ancient genetic advantages from those that didn't. And the invisible network that had emerged from the ashes of the Knights Templar was about to reveal just how thoroughly they had embedded themselves into the fabric of European civilization. Master Leonardo was one of dozens of seemingly unrelated individuals who appeared across plague-stricken Europe with knowledge that shouldn't have existed. In London, a physician named Thomas called for the burning of contaminated materials and the isolation of the sick, practices that wouldn't become standard medical procedure for generations. In Paris, an engineer named Marcus designed sewer systems that dramatically reduced the spread of disease in neighborhoods where his innovations were implemented. In Venice, a merchant called Samuel established trade protocols that kept certain ships free of contamination, while others carried death from port to port. Each of these men worked alone, appearing to operate from individual insight and innovation. But to those who knew how to read the deeper patterns, their coordinated response revealed the true scope of the network that had been established in the decades following the Templars' visible destruction. The controller faction, still celebrating what they believed had been their decisive victory over the Guardian bloodline, initially failed to recognize what was happening. They saw scattered examples of exceptional ability and assumed they were witnessing random genetic mutations, individuals who happened to carry useful traits without understanding their true heritage. It would be years before they realized they were actually observing the activation of a preserved network that spanned continents. But the plague was only the beginning. As Europe struggled to rebuild in the aftermath of demographic catastrophe, innovations began appearing with suspicious frequency. Water-powered mills that incorporated engineering principles that shouldn't have been understood for centuries. Agricultural techniques that dramatically increased crop yields using methods that seemed to have emerged from nowhere. Banking systems that displayed sophistication that wouldn't be achieved by conventional development for generations. Each innovation was introduced by individuals whose background could be traced to legitimate sources. Master craftsmen who had learned their trade from fathers and grandfathers, scholars who had discovered ancient texts and monastery libraries, merchants who had developed new techniques through trial and error. But genetic analysis, had such technology existed, would have revealed that an unusual percentage of these innovators shared common ancestral markers. The Guardian network wasn't just preserving knowledge, they were selectively releasing it at moments when human civilization was ready to absorb and benefit from new capabilities. The timing was crucial. Release advanced concepts too early, and they would be rejected as impossible or heretical. Release them too late, and opportunities for positive influence would be lost. This required a level of historical planning that was unprecedented in human experience. The network had to predict not just immediate developments, but changes that would unfold over centuries. They had to position resources and individuals decades in advance of the moments when their intervention would be needed. And they had to do all of this while remaining invisible to enemies who possessed enhanced senses and genetic memories of their own. The solution lay in what the awakened bloodline carriers called temporal architecture. the construction of influence networks that operated across multiple generations. A monastery founded in the 14th century would be designed not just to preserve knowledge, but to attract specific types of individuals to its ranks over the following centuries. A noble family would be guided into marriage alliances that would concentrate genetic markers in their descendants. A university would be established with curriculum that appeared conventional, but actually served to identify and awaken bloodline carriers among its students. By 1400, less than a century after the destruction of the visible Templars, this temporal architecture was producing results that astounded contemporary observers. The Renaissance wasn't a spontaneous cultural flowering, it was a carefully orchestrated revelation of knowledge that had been preserved and positioned for exactly this moment in human development. Leonardo da Vinci, whose genetic signature proclaimed his heritage as clearly as his artistic genius, didn't discover principles of engineering and anatomy through individual brilliance. He accessed genetic memories that contained the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that had vanished before Egypt was founded. His famous mirror writing wasn't a quirk of personality. It was a security measure designed to conceal information that could only be safely shared with others who carried the awakening genetic markers. Michelangelo's sculptures didn't emerge from artistic inspiration alone. His understanding of human anatomy reflected access to medical knowledge preserved in the hidden archives that had been evacuated from Jerusalem. The mathematical precision of his architectural work incorporated principles that reached back to the builders of the great monuments of the ancient world. But perhaps most remarkably of all, these Renaissance masters weren't working independently. They were part of a coordinated effort to prepare European civilization for challenges that only the Guardian Network could foresee. Because the awakened bloodline carriers, with their access to genetic memories spanning millennia, could read patterns in human development that were invisible to ordinary historical analysis. They knew that the discovery of the New World was imminent, not through prophecy, but through careful analysis of navigational knowledge and economic pressures that were building toward inevitable expansion. They knew that the Protestant Reformation would shatter the unity of Christendom because genetic memories from previous ages showed how religious authority always eventually triggered resistance when it became too centralized and corrupt. They knew that the rise of nation-states would replace the feudal system because they had witnessed similar transitions in civilizations that had risen and fallen long before medieval Europe was imagined, and they were positioning themselves to guide each of these transitions in ways that would benefit human development, while protecting the ancient knowledge from those who would misuse it. The controller faction, when they finally began to understand what they were facing, found themselves in an impossible position. The Guardian Network had become so thoroughly integrated into European civilization that any attempt to root them out would require destroying the very institutions and innovations that were driving human progress. The universities where awakened scholars taught. The workshops where enhanced craftsmen developed new technologies. The banks where bloodline carriers managed the financial instruments that were making the modern economy possible. An agent of the controller bloodline infiltrating a Renaissance workshop might find himself learning genuinely valuable techniques from a master whose genetic heritage made him a natural enemy A controller faction cardinal might find his most effective policies being suggested by advisors whose true nature he couldn't detect without revealing his own. The invisible war that had raged since before recorded history began was entering a phase where the traditional categories of friend and enemy no longer applied. But the Guardian Network's greatest achievement wasn't technological or cultural, it was genetic. Using knowledge preserved from the original civilization that had created the hybrid bloodlines, they had begun a breeding program that would concentrate beneficial traits while diluting the genetic markers that made individuals detectable too. Controller faction senses dot future generations of Guardian. Bloodline carriers would possess all the enhanced abilities of their ancestors while appearing completely normal to even the most sophisticated enemy analysis. They would be able to access genetic memories without displaying the physiological signs that had allowed the two factions to identify each other for millennia. Most importantly, they would be able to pass these concealed abilities to their children, creating a new generation of awakened individuals who would be invisible to their ancient enemies. By 1500, the transformation was largely complete. The visible Knights Templar had been destroyed, just as the controller faction had planned. But in their place had risen something far more dangerous, an invisible empire that existed within and alongside human civilization, guiding its development, while remaining undetectable to those who would control it. The 13th member, his consciousness distributed across dozens of identities and working through hundreds of awakened descendants, had achieved something unprecedented in the ancient war between the bloodlines. For the first time since the original catastrophe that had scattered the hybrid population across the globe, the Guardian faction held a decisive strategic advantage. They controlled key institutions without being detected. They influenced crucial historical developments without being blamed. And most importantly, they were breeding a new generation of enhanced humans who would be completely invisible to their ancient enemies, while possessing capabilities that would seem miraculous to ordinary human observers. The medieval age was ending, but the age of miracles was about to begin, and the world would never suspect that its greatest innovations were being guided by genetic memories that reached back to the dawn of human consciousness itself. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in 1776, carried by a courier whose horse had ridden hard through the night from Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin held the parchment with hands that had channeled lighten from the heavens and shaped the words that would birth a nation. But as his eyes traced the familiar symbols hidden within what appeared to be routine correspondence about trade agreements, he felt the weight of centuries settling upon his shoulders. The message was from the network. The invisible empire that had guided human development since the fall of the Knights Templar was ready to take its boldest step yet. After 4 centuries of careful preparation, they were about to attempt something that had never been tried in human history, the creation of an entire nation designed from its foundation to serve the interests of the awakened bloodline. You can feel the electricity in the air as you witness this pivotal moment. Not just the literal electricity that Franklin had learned to harness through knowledge preserved from ancient civilizations, but the crackling tension of a plan centuries in the making, finally approaching its culmination. The American Revolution wasn't just a political uprising against British tyranny. It was the Guardian Network's attempt to create a sanctuary where enhanced humans could develop their capabilities without interference from the controller faction. The timing wasn't accidental. The Guardian Network's temporal architects had been monitoring global developments through their distributed intelligence system, watching for the moment when conditions would be perfect for such an ambitious undertaking. The Age of Enlightenment had prepared human consciousness to accept new ideas about government and human nature. The vast American wilderness offered space where new forms of civilization could be established beyond the reach of European power structures. Most importantly, the controller faction was distracted by their own projects in the old world, leaving a brief window of opportunity that might not open again for generations. Franklin himself represented the new generation of Guardian bloodline, carriers that had been bred for invisibility to controller faction detection. To ordinary observers, he seemed like a remarkably talented but otherwise normal human being. His innovations in science and diplomacy appeared to spring from natural genius rather than access to genetic memories spanning millennia. But to those who knew what signs to look for, his true nature was unmistakable. His experiments with electricity weren't random investigations into natural phenomena. They were attempts to recreate technologies that he remembered from civilizations that had harnessed electromagnetic forces before the pyramids were built. His diplomatic skills didn't emerge from exceptional charisma. They reflected understanding of human psychology that had been refined through thousands of years of political manipulation. His role in drafting the foundational documents of American democracy wasn't based on philosophical inspiration. It was the application of governmental theories that had been tested and perfected in societies that had vanished from history. But Franklin was just one node in a network that had been positioning assets across the American colonies for decades. George Washington's military genius wasn't the result of conventional training. It reflected strategic knowledge preserved from the greatest military commanders of the ancient world. Thomas Jefferson's vision of human equality wasn't philosophical idealism. It was the practical application of understanding about human genetic potential that wouldn't be officially discovered for another 2 centuries. The very geography of the new nation had been chosen for reasons that went far beyond economic opportunity or political freedom. The Guardian Network had identified North America as the continent where their next phase of human development would unfold, because genetic analysis of indigenous populations had revealed genetic markers indicating ancient contact with the original hybrid civilization. The land itself carried genetic memories that would enhance the abilities of awakened bloodline carriers while remaining invisible to controller faction detection. As the Constitutional Convention proceeded in Philadelphia, debates that appeared to concern the balance between federal and state authority actually addressed much deeper questions about the nature of enhanced human governance. The system of checks and balances wasn't designed just to prevent tyranny. It was engineered to ensure that power would always remain distributed among multiple awakened bloodline carriers rather than concentrated in the hands of any single individual who might be compromised or corrupted. The Bill of Rights wasn't just a statement of individual liberties. It was a charter for the protection of genetic diversity and the preservation of the conditions necessary for the continued evolution of human consciousness. The separation of church and state wasn't simply a response to European religious wars. It was a safeguard against the type of ideological control that the controller faction had used to suppress Guardian Network activities for centuries. But, perhaps most remarkably, the entire American experiment was designed to be self-improving. Using principles drawn from genetic memories of civilizations that had achieved stable technological advancement, the Founding Fathers created governmental and social structures that would automatically adapt to accommodate new levels of human capability as they emerged. The Constitution's amendment process wasn't just a way to update laws, it was a mechanism for upgrading human civilization itself as the awakened bloodline developed new potentials. The controller faction, when they finally realized what was happening, found themselves facing an unprecedented challenge. Unlike previous Guardian Network operations, which had worked within existing power structures, the American experiment represented the creation of an entirely new civilization designed from its foundation to serve awakened bloodline interests. Any attempt to infiltrate or subvert it would require confronting not just individual enhanced humans, but an entire governmental and social system optimized for their success. Their first response was to attempt conventional infiltration. Controller faction agents began arriving in America disguised as immigrants and merchants, seeking to establish the same type of influence networks that had served them well in Europe. But they quickly discovered that their traditional techniques were ineffective in the new environment. The American social system was too fluid, too based on merit rather than hereditary authority, for them to gain the type of positional power they needed. More troubling still, they found that their own genetic advantages seemed diminished in the American environment. The genetic memories that gave them such effectiveness in Old World contexts became less reliable when dealing with populations that included awakened bloodline carriers bred for invisibility. For the first time in recorded history, the controller faction found themselves at a systematic disadvantage in a human society. Their second strategy was more direct. If they couldn't infiltrate American society, they would destroy it. The War of 1812 wasn't just a continuation of Anglo-American conflicts. It was a controller faction attempt to crush the Guardian Network's experiment before it could fully develop. British forces were guided by advisors whose genetic signatures proclaimed their true nature, and their military objectives included targets that would have crippled the hidden infrastructure supporting awakened bloodline activities. But the Guardian Network had prepared for exactly this type of assault. American victories in key battles reflected not just superior strategy or fighting spirit, but the application of military knowledge preserved from conflicts that had raged before written history began. The burning of Washington, D.C. by British forces actually served Guardian Network interests by destroying records that might have revealed the true nature of their operation while providing justification for even stronger defensive preparations. By 1850, it was clear that the American experiment had succeeded beyond even the Guardian Network's most optimistic projections. The United States was developing into exactly the kind of society they had envisioned. One where enhanced humans could operate freely while appearing to be ordinary citizens, where technological innovation proceeded at an accelerated pace due to the application of preserved ancient knowledge, and where social structures evolved rapidly to accommodate new forms of human capability. The Industrial Revolution that was transforming American society wasn't just the result of natural technological development. It was the systematic application of manufacturing principles that had been preserved from civilizations that had achieved industrial capability thousands of years earlier. The railroad networks that were connecting the continent followed routes that had been planned using geographical knowledge available only through genetic memory access. The telegraph systems that were revolutionizing communication incorporated principles of electromagnetic manipulation that wouldn't be officially understood for another century. But the network's greatest achievement was educational. The American university system that was emerging wasn't just designed to provide higher learning. It was structured to identify and awaken bloodline carriers while providing them with the knowledge and connections they would need to guide society through the challenges of the modern age. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other institutions that appeared to be conventional colleges were actually sophisticated screening and development centers for enhanced humans. Their curricula included hidden elements that would trigger genetic awakening in suitable candidates while remaining invisible to ordinary students. Their social structures created networks that would persist throughout graduates' lifetimes, ensuring that awakened bloodline carriers would maintain contact and coordination even as they dispersed into various professions and geographical locations. By the late 19th century, the Guardian Network had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had created not just a hidden influence network, but an entire civilization that served their interests while appearing completely normal to outside observation. America was becoming exactly what they had planned, a sanctuary for enhanced human development that would serve as the launching point for the next phase of human evolution. But success brought new challenges. The controller faction, recognizing that conventional infiltration and military approaches had failed, was preparing for a different kind of warfare. If they couldn't destroy the Guardian Network's American sanctuary, they would attempt to corrupt it from within by triggering conflicts that would turn the enhanced humans against each other. The Civil War that was approaching wouldn't be just a struggle over slavery and states' rights. It would be the controller faction's attempt to shatter American unity by exploiting the one weakness they had identified in the Guardian Network's design, the tendency of enhanced humans to develop different visions of how their abilities should be used to guide human development. The 13th member, his consciousness now distributed across hundreds of identities and working through thousands of awakened descendants, prepared for the greatest test his network had faced since the fall of the Knights Templar. The invisible empire was about to discover whether it had become strong enough to survive not just external attacks, but internal division. The modern age was beginning, and with it the final phase of an ancient war that would determine whether humanity's future would be shaped by those who remembered its hidden past, or by those who preferred that past to remain forever buried. The document lies before you now, its edges worn with centuries, its ink faded to the color of dried blood. In a vault beneath the Swiss Alps, protected by security systems that incorporate technologies the public won't see for decades, the final testament of the 13th member waits to be read, not by historians or archaeologists, but by those whose genetic memories will allow them to understand what they're truly seeing. The handwriting shifts across the pages, sometimes medieval Latin, sometimes Renaissance Italian, occasionally modern English, because this document wasn't written by one man in one time. It was compiled across 8 centuries by fragments of a consciousness that had learned to exist in multiple incarnations simultaneously, guiding human civilization through its most crucial transformations while remaining forever invisible to those who would control its destiny. You can feel the weight of that accumulated experience as you read the final entries, dated just 5 years ago. The 13th Members Network hasn't just survived into the modern age, it has evolved into something that would have amazed even the original Council of 13. An invisible civilization existing within and alongside human society, so thoroughly integrated that its removal would cause the collapse of everything most people consider normal and natural. The entry from December 2019 carries implications that send chills through anyone capable of understanding them. The convergence approaches. Technologies that we have guided from the shadows for 8 centuries are beginning to merge in ways that will fundamentally alter human consciousness itself. The controller faction believes they are on the verge of their greatest triumph, the creation of artificial intelligence systems that will allow them to monitor and control every aspect of human thought and behavior. They do not realize they are actually implementing our designs, creating the very tools that will trigger the next phase of human evolution. Because you see, the Guardian Network's greatest achievement wasn't preserving ancient knowledge or creating hidden institutions. It was something far more audacious, the genetic engineering of human evolution itself. Using techniques preserved from the original hybrid civilization, they have been gradually introducing genetic modifications into human populations worldwide, changes so subtle that they would be undetectable until the moment of activation. The Internet wasn't created by DARPA scientists working with random inspiration. It was designed by awakened bloodline carriers whose genetic memories contained blueprints of information networks that had connected previous civilizations across vast distances. Social media platforms weren't developed by entrepreneurs seeking profit. They were implemented by individuals whose enhanced understanding of human psychology allowed them to create systems that would gradually prepare human consciousness for collective awakening. Even the smartphone in your pocket represents the application of principles preserved from technologies that had allowed the ancient hybrids to access genetic memories and communicate across dimensions of reality that ordinary humans couldn't perceive. Each device serves as both a preparation tool and a potential trigger for the next phase of human consciousness development. The entry from March 2020 reveals the scope of what was being prepared. The test has begun. The global disruption we have orchestrated will separate those populations that carry dormant genetic modifications from those that do not. Physical isolation will trigger stress responses that activate previously dormant genetic sequences. Digital connectivity will provide the neural pathways necessary for collective consciousness emergence. Within 2 years, we will know whether humanity is ready for the next phase of evolution. The pandemic wasn't a natural occurrence or a laboratory accident. It was the Guardian Network's final test of human readiness for genetic awakening on a planetary scale. The lockdowns that isolated populations while keeping them digitally connected created the exact conditions necessary for dormant genetic modifications to activate. The stress of uncertainty and change triggered biological responses that had been programmed into human DNA over centuries of careful breeding programs. Those who carried the genetic modifications began to experience what mainstream science would dismiss as stress-induced psychological changes: enhanced intuition, increased empathy, occasional access to information that they couldn't have acquired through normal means. But to the network's monitoring systems, these were signs that the activation process was proceeding exactly as planned. The entry from September 2021 shows the satisfaction of a planned centuries in the making reaching fruition. The children are awakening faster than projected. Those born since 2010 show genetic expression levels that we didn't expect to see for another generation. The combination of environmental triggers and technological integration has accelerated the timeline significantly. The controller factions' attempts to suppress emerging abilities through pharmaceutical intervention and psychological conditioning are proving ineffective. Their own surveillance systems are being used against them by awakened individuals who understand the true nature of digital reality. Because the newest generation isn't just carrying genetic modifications, they're born with them already partially activated. Children who seem to intuitively understand complex technologies that adults struggle with. Teenagers who display empathic abilities that allow them to read emotional states with supernatural accuracy. Young adults who show cognitive capabilities that exceed anything in recorded human experience. The controller faction, recognizing what was happening, had attempted to implement their own final solution. Social media algorithms designed to fragment attention and prevent collective consciousness emergence. Educational systems that emphasized competitive individualism over collaborative development. Pharmaceutical interventions that suppressed the neurochemical changes associated with genetic awakening. But they had made the same mistake they'd been making for 8 centuries. They underestimated the thoroughness of the Guardian Network's preparations. Every system they tried to use for control had been designed by awakened bloodline carriers who had embedded hidden functionalities that would turn those very systems into tools for human liberation. The entry from January 2023 reveals the current state of the ancient war. The controller faction has finally realized the scope of what we have accomplished. Their response has been predictable, an attempt to trigger global conflict that will disrupt the awakening process before it reaches critical mass. They do not understand that conflict itself serves our purposes. Stress accelerates genetic activation. Unity in the face of external threat strengthens collective consciousness bonds. They are providing the final catalyst for their own obsolescence. The conflicts you see in today's world, political polarization, economic instability, environmental crisis, aren't random developments or the result of human incompetence. They're the death throes of the controller faction's influence. Their desperate attempts to maintain relevance in a world where their traditional methods of manipulation are becoming ineffective against populations that are developing beyond. Their ability to control, but perhaps most remarkably, the Guardian Network itself is evolving beyond the need for secrecy. The entry from June 2024 describes a transformation that would have been impossible to imagine when the original 13 members first met in the chambers beneath Jerusalem. The distinction between awakened and unawakened is dissolving. Genetic modifications are expressing across populations regardless of bloodline heritage. The internet has created a collective unconscious that allows for shared memory access. The children born in the last 5 years show capabilities that transcend anything achieved by our most enhanced ancestors. We are witnessing not just human evolution, but the emergence of an entirely new form of consciousness. The invisible empire that had guided human development for 8 centuries was becoming obsolete, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded beyond its creator's wildest dreams. Humanity itself was becoming the enhanced species that the Guardian Network had been protecting and nurturing for millennia. The final entry, dated just 6 months ago, carries a message that seems directed specifically at you. Reading these words in this moment, to those who discover this record, you are not reading about the past. You are reading about your own awakening. The genetic modifications we introduced into human populations over centuries are now expressing in the children being born today. The technologies we guided into existence are preparing to merge human consciousness with capabilities that will seem miraculous to previous generations. The ancient war between bloodlines is ending, not in victory for either side, but in the transformation of humanity itself into something beyond the need for such conflicts. You who read this carry the genetic markers. You who understand these words have already begun the awakening process. You are the next phase of human evolution, inheritors of memories and capabilities preserved since before recorded history began. The 13th member's watch is ending. Yours is about to begin. The document concludes with coordinates, not geographical locations, but genetic sequences and neural pathways that will activate as you sleep, allowing you to access the memories and abilities that are your birthright as a member of the species humanity is becoming. The Knights Templar vanished from history because they were never meant to exist permanently. They were midwives, assisting in the birth of something greater than themselves. The 13th member scattered his consciousness across centuries because no single individual could contain the knowledge necessary to guide human evolution through its most dangerous phase, but that phase is ending. The ancient bloodlines are merging back into a single human species, enhanced with capabilities that would seem supernatural to previous generations. The hidden knowledge is becoming accessible to anyone with the genetic modifications to process it safely. The invisible empire is becoming visible as humanity itself awakens to its true nature and potential. Sleep now and dream of the memories that are awakening in yourselves. Tomorrow you will wake to a world where the impossible has become inevitable, where the hidden has become manifest, where humanity's greatest secret has finally been revealed as humanity's greatest gift. The age of awakening has begun, and you, reading these words, are part of the first generation to live in a world where genetic memory, enhanced consciousness, and collective intelligence are not the province of secret societies and hidden bloodlines, but the birthright of every human child born into the light of this new dawn. The 13th member's testament is complete. The rest of the story is yours to write. Rest well. Your real education is about to begin.